Hi, my name is Maria Cheevers, and I'm the Director of Research and Development for the Boston Police Department. Today I'm here to talk a little bit about Boston's Smart Policing Initiative BJA grant, and I'll tell you the story in two parts. The first grant that we received was a grant to help Boston look at our clearance rate in terms of fatal shootings. And the second supplemental grant is going to enable us to take a similar look at our non-fatal shootings and Boston's response to those non-fatal shootings. They dovetail in that what we've learned from the Homicide Clearance Project will be able to help us improve our response not only to clearance of homicides, but clearance of non-fatal shootings. So to start from the beginning, one of the first things that we did when we got the grant is go through a two-part strategy. And when I talk about these strategies, I like to talk about them as if two trains are leaving the station at the same exact time. There's the implementation, organizational change train, and then at the same time, separately but related, is the research train. The first train that we're talking about is around organizational change within the Boston Police Department, as well as with the DA's office around organizationally improving the way we basically investigate homicides. And with that said, we started off by researching best practices all over the world on how other departments investigate their homicides, and it was pretty obvious early on that the biggest struggle that Boston faces with homicide clearance is when they're gang-involved homicides, because people tend to not want to come forward, they do not want to talk. And so we narrowed down the sites that we would look at in terms of best practices to sites that had very similar demographic challenges around that particular type of homicide. However, we also looked at the UK because the UK had such a promising model in other ways. And so we also looked at the medical community. So when you think about the medical community and the way in which they handle a crisis in an emergency room, and the way they work with the multidisciplinary teams, and they create checklists, and they have checks and balances, that is the type of model we needed to develop from scratch in Boston. So we brought together folks from the DA's office, the Boston Police Department's Crime Scene Response Unit, underneath that unit the Latent Prints Unit, the DNA, firearms analysis, with everyone from the first police officer, a patrol officer that responded to a call for a homicide, to the detectives in the districts that typically or always investigate non-fatals, not fatals, as well as the patrol supervisors in the districts and the homicide detectives. So organizationally, we needed to bring everybody in the room that had anything to do even remotely with a homicide call for service and the follow-up that took place afterwards. We spent about 6 months in that room. My office was charged, I'm the director of the Office of Research and Development. We do a lot of strategic planning, convening, facilitating. So our office was charged with managing a 6-month planning process, strategic planning process with this multidisciplinary team, and to bring them through a process where we flattened out what a homicide call for service looked like, every step that took place in a response to a homicide. In flattening it out, we broke it down into segments, and then we looked at best practices of each response, of each segment, of each component. And we worked with them to say, listen, would this work? If this is a challenge for this piece of it, these are the best practices. What would you like to try out that may resolve that challenge? Component 2, you're at your second stage. This is when the detectives show up. What works, what doesn't work? This is what the best practice looks like. Which would you like to try? Why would you like to try it? Why wouldn't it work? And we did this every step of the way until at the very end of the 6-month process, we had 9 different protocols and procedures that were developed by that multidisciplinary team that Boston was going to then do differently from, I believe it was November 2014 forward. As well, not only do we have 9 protocols and procedures that we created that would then be implemented, but we also had 3 different checklists at 3 different points of contacts that police officers are now using regularly when they go to a call for service for a homicide. There were other things that were tightened up along the way that didn't need to be put in either the checklists or the protocols and procedures. So at the end of that, we did a series of trainings with particularly the 4 hotspot neighborhoods, the patrol supervisors, the homicide detectives, and patrol officers in those hotspot areas. And we said, listen, this is how you're going to respond the next time you get a homicide call for service. We also did an e-learning training video so that training video was put out to every police officer in Boston. We did commissioner's memorandums and training bulletins. So there was somewhat of an attempt, even though the timeline was very small, to educate and train everybody before we kicked off the new set of responses to homicide. We've been doing the implementation phase since November 2014. Actually, I'm sorry, it was November 2013, time flies. And we've been collecting information through focus groups and other ways to figure out what works, what doesn't work, what would you like to employ more of, etc. So we have these focus groups with people in the field that are practicing the new skill sets that they've learned through training, but also the new protocols and policies. The whole time that this was taking place, Anthony Braga was in the background, coding thousands and thousands and thousands of past homicide case files to determine what in those past records, what strategies that we had used in the past were actually effective in solving homicides and figuring out what didn't work and other things that are being sort of coded out to learn more about our past response to homicides. Now let's fast forward. You got 2 trains that are now meeting its destination. I think Anthony will be done with his research in another 2 months. That's when the destination will be met. At that point in time, we can move forward and say, okay, since November 13, when we started doing these new protocols and procedures, has there been a difference in our clearance rate for homicides than prior to that, based on these new policies? And what does that look like in terms of the coding and the data? So that's going to be the question that we get to ask when both of the trains meet at the station. We will fill you in on how that goes at that time. In the meantime, we've received a supplemental grant from Smart Policing that is going to allow us to kick off a project that's very related, and that project is going to be able to have us take a look at our non-fatal shooting case files in a very similar, detailed way to figure out what works with non-fatal shootings, what doesn't work in investigating non-fatal shootings in terms of clearance, and how these new protocols can maybe be begged, borrowed, and stole from homicide response to the detectives in the districts who do the non-fatal investigations. And that's something we look forward to.